The Liberty's Dawn drifted among the asteroids like a wounded animal seeking shelter, and the old frigate had bought herself some time but barely, and Captain Shaw stood on a bridge that looked more like a disaster zone with sparks flying from damaged consoles and lights flickering and smoke hanging in the air, despite the life support systems working overtime. And Chief Henderson appeared with his uniform streaked with grease and coolant, and he reported that he had managed to stabilize Reactor 1, but everything else was falling apart and they were down to 40% thrust capacity and weapons at 60%, and shields held together by hope and prayer, and one more direct hit would finish them. And Lieutenant Morrison studied the tactical display showing that the Krathians were sweeping the asteroid field methodically, and they were not in a hurry anymore because they knew the human ship could not escape, and they had maybe 30 minutes before they were found and destroyed. Ensign Lee suddenly reported that their distress signal was bouncing off the asteroid field minerals and creating echo patterns, and some of those echoes were making it through the jamming field in fragments, and Shaw asked how much was getting through, and Lee said maybe 10% of the signal and not enough for anyone to understand their situation, but enough to know something was happening in this system. And Dr. Lisa Grant came to the bridge having left sickbay in the care of her assistant, and she told Shaw they had 17 wounded with 3 in critical condition. And if they were planning something desperate, now was the time, because half the crew would not survive another hour of fighting. And Shaw nodded slowly, as a plan formed in his mind, and he asked Morrison to pull up everything they knew about Krathian tactical doctrine. Morrison worked quickly and reported that standard Imperial Navy tactics relied on overwhelming firepower and direct assault with minimal maneuvering, and they used shields and armor to absorb damage while closing to optimal firing range. And they were effective against military targets, but historically they struggled with unconventional warfare because they thought it was beneath them. And Shaw said that was exactly what they would use against the Krathians, and they would stop acting like a military vessel and start acting like something else, and Lieutenant Palmer asked what they would act like. And Shaw said they would become a ghost story that the Krathians would tell their children about, and the crew looked at him like he had lost his mind, but they trusted him enough to listen. Shaw ordered the Liberty's Dawn to go completely dark with engines off and weapons offline, and even life support reduced to minimum, and the ship became a cold, silent hulk drifting among the asteroids and nearly indistinguishable from the rocks around her, and the crew huddled in their environmental suits as the temperature dropped, and they watched their displays in silence as the Krathian Dreadnought swept past their position with its powerful sensors, scanning for heat signatures and energy emissions and anything that would reveal their prey. And the Dreadnought passed within 5 kilometers, and on the bridge no one even breathed, and Commander Vec Thor's frustrated voice broadcast on all frequencies demanding surrender and promising honorable death if they gave up now, or painful examples if they continued hiding. But Shaw did not respond because he could not risk revealing their position, and instead, he watched and waited. After the Dreadnought passed, Shaw ordered a single cold restart of their engines, and the Liberty's Dawn came back to life quietly like a predator waking from sleep, and Henderson had done something remarkable by modifying their exhaust systems to disperse their heat signature across a wider area, making them look like thermal venting from the asteroids themselves. And the cat and mouse game began in earnest, with the Liberty's Dawn playing dead 3 more times over the next hour, and each time waiting for the Dreadnought to pass before repositioning to a new hiding spot. And Shaw was not just running but learning, and Morrison had been using each close pass to gather detailed scans of the Dreadnought, and she reported that she thought she had found something important. Morrison explained that the Krathian shield generators cycled every 12 minutes for maintenance, and there was a 4-second window where specific sections dropped to 80% strength, and it was not much, but if they could time an attack perfectly, they might be able to penetrate to critical systems. And Shaw asked where these sections were located, and Morrison highlighted them on the tactical display, but she pointed out that they would need to hit all 3 points simultaneously to have any chance of causing real damage, and they did not have enough weapons left to do that. And Ensign Lee, who had been quietly working at his station, said he might have an idea, and it was risky and might not work, but it was something. Lee explained that the Krathian jamming signal was powerful, but also rigid with standard Imperial encryption and no deviation, and he suggested they could feed the jamming system false data and make the Krathians think the Liberty's Dawn was somewhere she was not. and Shaw asked if he was talking about spoofing their energy signature. And Lee said more than that. And what if they could make the Krethians think there were multiple human ships in the system by creating phantom contacts? And Henderson joined the conversation, saying he could divert power from non-essential systems and create energy bursts that might read like engine signatures on Krethian sensors, and it would not fool them for long, but it might buy a few minutes, and Shaw ordered them to do it. The Liberty's Dawn began broadcasting phantom energy signatures from strategic points in the asteroid field, and to the Krethian sensors, it suddenly looked like multiple human vessels were converging on their position, and Commander Vec Thor immediately ordered defensive formations, and his Dreadnought rotated to face multiple threat vectors, and the Krethian broadcast that reinforcements would not save the humans, and he would destroy each vessel one by one. And Shaw still did not respond, because he was counting seconds and watching the shield cycle timers that Morrison had calculated. And the Dreadnought was sweeping space with weapons fire, trying to flush out the phantom ships that did not exist. Morrison reported 30 seconds to optimal firing position, and that she had loaded their last missiles with proximity triggers so they would detonate near the shield weak points, even if they did not score direct hits, and Palmer counted down the seconds as the Liberty's Dawn glided through space on momentum alone, with engines cold like a bullet, fired hours ago, finally reaching its target, and the Dreadnought's shields shimmered as sections rotated through their maintenance cycle, just as Morrison had predicted. And at the exact moment Shaw gave the order to fire, and the Liberty's Dawn erupted from the asteroid field like a risen ghost, with engines roaring to life and weapons ports opening and every remaining missile launching. In a coordinated spread, the missiles streaked toward the Dreadnought, and each one was targeted at a specific shield weak point, and the Krethians tried to respond, but they were caught mid-rotation, expecting threats from multiple directions, and by the time they realized all the phantom contacts were decoys, it was too late, and 3 missiles penetrated the shields during the 4-second window and detonated against the Dreadnought's hull, blowing open armor plating and exposing internal systems. And it was not enough to destroy the massive vessel, but it was enough to hurt it. And for the first time, Commander Vec Thor sounded uncertain as he said it was impossible that no human ship could calculate that attack. And Shaw muttered that apparently they could, and he ordered Palmer to get them out of there at maximum burn. And the Liberty's Dawn raced away as the Dreadnought's weapons finally responded, and they dove deep into the densest part of the asteroid field, where the rocks were too numerous for the Dreadnought to follow safely. And Henderson reported that the burn had nearly killed them, and both reactors were redlining, and they were venting coolant from 6 sections. And the port nacelle was probably only attached by willpower at this point, and they had one more run like that before the ship came apart, and Shaw said they would make it count. The Liberty's Dawn drifted in the shadow of the system's dead star, which was a brown dwarf that provided just enough radiation to mask their energy signature, and the ship was dying, with Chief Henderson performing miracles to keep her flying. But even miracles had limits, and Captain Shaw walked through the corridors past crew members making emergency repairs with whatever materials they could find, and he stopped at sick bay where Dr. Grant tended to the wounded, and he asked how they were doing, and Grant did not look up from her patient as she said she had 3 who would not make it if they did not get to a real medical facility soon, and another dozen who should not be at their stations but refused to leave, and Shaw's crew was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, and she had not decided which, and Shaw asked if it could be both, and she finally looked at him with exhaustion clear in her eyes. Shaw continued his walk, stopping by engineering, where Henderson was elbow-deep in conduits trying to coax a few more minutes of life from the failing systems, and Shaw asked for an honest assessment and whether the ship could fly, and Henderson pulled himself out of the access panel with his face grave, and he said the Liberty's Dawn had given everything she had, with the port reactor operating at 30% efficiency and the starboard reactor showing containment field fluctuations that should have them evacuating the engineering section, and structural integrity was compromised in 12 sections, and they had no shields left to speak of, and half their maneuvering thrusters were offline. But when Shaw asked again if she could fly, Henderson grinned and said she would fly one more time, but after that she had earned her rest. Back on the bridge, Shaw found his senior officers gathered around the tactical display, and Lieutenant Morrison had been working on something, and she showed him a 3-dimensional rendering of the system, with the Krethian Dreadnought conducting a systematic search pattern and support vessels positioned to create a sensor net, And their phantom contact trick would not work again, because the Krethians knew they were alone now. And Shaw asked about their distress signal, and Ensign Lee shook, his head saying it was still being jammed and they would need to get outside the jamming field radius, which was approximately 2 million kilometers from the Dreadnought, and at their current speed and condition they would never make it, because the Krethians would run them down long before they cleared the field. Lieutenant Palmer studied the display and suggested using the dead star's gravity, well, to slingshot around it and gain enough velocity to make a run for the jamming field edge. But Henderson pointed out they would need full thrust for at least 10 minutes to build up that velocity, and he could not promise the reactors would hold together that long, and they would be completely exposed during the maneuver with the Krethians having clear firing solutions the entire time. And Shaw leaned over the display studying it from every angle, and he asked what if they did not try to escape but drew the Krethians in instead, and Morrison looked at him sharply, asking if he wanted to lure them closer, and Shaw said yes. Shaw explained that the Dead Star put out enormous amounts of radiation that was masking their signature, but also interfered with sensors, and if they could get the Krethians to follow them close to the star, it might blind their targeting systems, long enough to get a clear shot at their command center, and Palmer said that was suicide, because the radiation levels near the star would overwhelm their shielding in minutes, and they would be cooked alive. But Shaw countered that the Krethians would be too, and the Liberty's dawn was already falling apart with nothing left to lose, and the question was, could they hurt the Dreadnought badly enough before they went down that it could not continue its mission? And Dr. Grant spoke up from the doorway where she had been listening, and she said Shaw was not talking about disabling them but destroying them. Shaw met her eyes and said he was talking about making sure no other human ship faced what they had faced, and sending a message to the Krethian Empire that humans would never surrender or break or stop fighting, even if it cost them everything. And there was a long silence on the bridge before Morrison asked how they would do it. And Shaw laid out his strategy, which was desperate and probably impossible and definitely suicidal, but also the only chance they had, and the Liberty's dawn would broadcast on all frequencies, issuing a challenge to Commander Vector, and they would use the Krethian warrior culture against them by calling out the Dreadnought captain's honor and questioning his courage for hiding behind superior firepower, and the goal was to enrage him enough that he would follow them into the radiation zone near the Dead Star, where his sensor advantage would be neutralized. Once there, the Liberty's dawn would use the last of its weapons in a coordinated strike, not against the Dreadnought's weapons or engines, but against its reactor containment. And if they could breach the containment field, the resulting explosion should destroy the Dreadnought and disrupt the jamming field long enough for their distress signal to get through. But the problem was range, because they needed to be very close for their damaged weapons to penetrate the Dreadnought's armor, which meant the Liberty's dawn would be at the center of the blast when the reactor went, and Morrison calculated they would have maybe 30 seconds to evacuate in escape pods after they fired. But Shaw shook his head and said the radiation near the star would fry the pod systems and anyone they launched would drift dead in space within hours, and if they did this, they would do it together, because this ship had been their home, and it would be their tomb. But they would make it count. Shaw gave the crew one last choice by opening ship-wide communications and telling everyone their situation, and that they were out of options and time, and nearly out of ship, and he had developed a plan that might stop the Dreadnought and warn the fleet about the Krethian advance, but it was a one-way trip, and they would not be coming home, and he said they had one functional escape pod left that might carry 5 or 6 people to safety if they launched it now before they engaged, and those people would drift for a while. But the distress beacon echoes should eventually bring help, and he asked for volunteers to take that pod with no shame and no judgment, because they had all already proven their courage, and the bridge was silent, as Shaw waited. Finally, Henderson's voice came over the intercom saying that engineering had a full crew, and nobody was moving toward that escape pod because they started this fight together, and they would finish it together. And similar reports came in from every section with not a single crew member volunteering for the escape pod. And Shaw felt his throat tighten as he said he was honored to serve with each and every one of them, and he ordered all hands to battle stations because they were going hunting. And he told Lee to open a channel to the Krethian Dreadnought because it was time to get their attention. Commander Vector's scaled face filled the view screen with his expression a mix of anger and curiosity, and scorch marks visible on his bridge, indicating that the Liberty's Dawn's earlier attack had done more damage than the Krethians wanted. To admit, and he asked what the human captain wanted, and Shaw stood straightening his torn uniform. And he said he wanted to know if the great Krethian warrior culture was as mighty as their propaganda claimed, or if it was all just talk from a species that only knew how to win when they outnumbered their opponents 100 to 1, and Vecthor's eyes narrowed dangerously. The Krethian Dreadnought fired first with a single plasma lance that was meant to be a warning shot, and the beam of superheated energy tore through space where the Liberty's Dawn had been positioned just seconds before, and Captain Shaw had given helm control to Lieutenant Greg Palmer, who was the best pilot on the ship, and Palmer threw the old frigate into an emergency burn that should have ripped the hull apart from the stress, but somehow the ancient vessel held together with her frame, groaning and metal screaming but not breaking, and Shaw ordered all weapons to fire, and the Liberty's Dawn unleashed everything she had with railgun batteries spitting metal slugs and missile pods, launching their payloads, and laser arrays cutting lines of light through the darkness, and the barrage looked impressive, like fireworks in the void. But against the Dreadnought's shields it might as well have been children throwing pebbles at a fortress wall, and the Krethian shields did not even flicker under the assault. Commander Vecthor's laughter came over the open channel, and he said that if this was the best humanity could offer, then he would not even need to use his full weapons array. And Lieutenant Morrison studied her tactical display with desperate intensity, and she told Shaw that the Krethian shield geometry followed a standard configuration that all their ships used, and if they could get close enough, there might be weak points at the aft ventral section where the primary generators created interference patterns. And Shaw asked how close they would need to get, and Morrison said uncomfortably close, within 200 meters, and Chief Henderson interrupted from engineering to say that the starboard reactor was showing dangerous fluctuations, because the last emergency maneuver had stressed the coolant systems beyond their limits, and if they kept flying like this, the ship would tear herself apart before the Krethians finished the job. Shaw made a decision that was either brilliant or insane, and he asked Henderson if he could give one more hard burn with everything the engines had left, and Henderson said he could manage one, maybe two more, before the reactor safeties would lock them down permanently, and Shaw told Palmer to plot an intercept course that would take them straight toward the Dreadnought. And Palmer looked at him like he was crazy, but he did as ordered, and the Liberty's Dawn accelerated toward the massive enemy ship at full burn, while executing a corkscrew pattern that made half the crew sick but kept the Krethian gunners from getting a clean targeting lock, and plasma fire lit up the space around them with each near miss, reminding everyone how outmatched they were and how close they were dancing with death. As they closed the distance, Ensign Lee picked up something strange on his sensors, and he reported that he was detecting multiple encrypted transmissions between the Dreadnought and something else in the outer system, and Morrison pulled up the data and confirmed that Lee was right, and there were at least 3 more Krethian vessels in the system, probably destroyers that were providing communication relay and observation support, and this was not just an attack but a test, and the Krethians were recording everything and gathering data on human tactics and capabilities before their main invasion, and Shaw understood immediately that they needed to survive long enough to get their distress signal through the jamming, and they needed to fight in a way that the Krethians had never seen before, so that any data they gathered would be useless. Chief Henderson came up with a plan that was completely crazy, and he flooded the Liberty's Dawn's exhaust ports with unburned fuel and reactor coolant, creating a massive cloud of superheated gas and debris behind the ship. And then at Shaw's command, he vented atmosphere from the port cargo bay, creating a spinning maneuver that should have been impossible for a ship of their class, and the Liberty's Dawn disappeared into her own gas cloud, just as a plasma barrage arrived at their last known position, and the Krethians thought they had scored a direct hit, and for precious seconds the Dreadnought ceased fire, believing their prey was crippled or destroyed, and those seconds were all Palmer needed to bring the Liberty's Dawn screaming out of the cloud on a perpendicular vector, now heading toward the Dreadnought's ventral section, with the old ship rattling like she would shake apart at any moment, but somehow holding together through sheer stubborn will. Morrison prepared the mining charges, which were tools meant for asteroid operations and not weapons of war. But at this range, and with the element of surprise, they might just work. And the Liberty's Dawn raced toward the underside of the Dreadnought, weaving through increasingly frantic defensive fire. As the Krethians realized they had been fooled, and the gap closed with the distance shrinking rapidly. And at 100 meters, Shaw gave the order to launch all charges and 20 mining explosives, shot out from the cargo bay. And they were crude weapons with basic propulsion and simple detonators, but at this range, even the Crethean shields could not stop all of them. And 3 charges made it through the defensive screen and detonated against the Dreadnought's hull, and the damage was minimal, just scorched armor and minor system disruptions. But it did something more important than damage, and it made Commander Vec Thor furious. The Crethean commander roared over the open channel that he had had enough of games, and he ordered all weapons brought to bear with concentrated fire, and he wanted the human ship reduced to atoms and nothing left but scattered molecules, and the Dreadnought began to rotate its primary weapons arrays, bringing devastating firepower to focus on the small frigate. But in doing so, it had to adjust its shield configuration, and Morrison shouted that she saw a shield fluctuation in sections 4 through 7, and a gap had opened for 3 seconds, and Shaw told her to mark the location, because they would need that information later, and he ordered Palmer to get them out of there at maximum burn. The Liberty's Dawn fled at full thrust, with the Dreadnought's weapons lighting up space behind them, like an angry god throwing lightning bolts, and one blast clipped their aft shields, sending the crew tumbling from their stations and alarms blaring throughout the ship. And Henderson's voice crackled over the intercom saying that aft shields were at 20%, and Reactor 2 was offline, and they were venting plasma from the port nacelle, and there were microfractures throughout the superstructure, and the ship was holding together but barely, and another hit like that would finish them. And Shaw watched the Dreadnought pursue them on the tactical display, and he asked how long until their message could break through the jamming. And Lee shook, his head saying the jamming field was too strong and they were inside the effective radius, and they would need to either destroy the jamming array or get outside the field, and they were too slow to outrun the Dreadnought, and the array was buried deep inside the enemy ship where they could never reach it. Shaw told his crew to prepare for the next phase because they were going to teach these aliens why humans had earned their place among the stars, through determination and refusal to accept defeat. And the Liberty's Dawn limped toward an asteroid field at the edge of the system where she could hide and buy time to think and plan, and maybe find a way to survive just a little bit longer. The year was 2247, and the old patrol frigate named Liberty's Dawn moved slowly through the dark edges of human space near the Kepler frontier, where stars were scattered like forgotten dreams, and planets held no life at all. And Captain Daniel, Shaw stood on the bridge watching the empty void through the main screen, thinking about his retirement that would come in just 3 months after 40 years of service to the Colonial Navy, and this posting was his last assignment, before he could finally rest and go home to Earth where his daughter waited with her 2 children, who barely knew their grandfather, because he had spent most of his life among the stars serving on ships that no one remembered, and doing jobs that no one noticed. And the Liberty's Dawn herself was over 40 years old, with a hull that showed every year of hard service and weapons that belonged in a museum, rather than on an active warship. And her crew of 68 souls was a strange mix of old veterans, like himself who had nowhere else to go, and young recruits fresh from the academy, who had drawn the unlucky assignment of frontier patrol duty, where nothing ever happened, and boredom was the greatest enemy they would face. Lieutenant Kate Morrison sat at the tactical station running diagnostics on weapon systems that barely functioned anymore, and she was brilliant according to her academy records, but she had never seen real combat, and probably never would because the frontier was quiet, and the alien races that humanity had encountered over the past century had learned to respect human borders and leave them alone, and Chief Engineer Paul Henderson was down in the engine room cursing at the aging reactors that he kept running through sheer willpower and spare parts. He fabricated himself because the Navy had stopped sending proper replacement parts for ships as old as the Liberty's Dawn years ago, and Ensign Marcus Lee monitored the communications station where nothing but static and automated beacon signals filled the speakers hour after hour and day after day, and Dr. Lisa Grant was in sickbay, treating the minor injuries and illnesses that came with life aboard a ship that was falling apart one system at a time, and nobody really expected anything to change, because this was the outer rim where retired captains went to finish their careers, and young officers paid their dues before moving on to better assignments and the liberties. Dawn was scheduled to be decommissioned in 3 months when they returned to the naval yards, where she would be stripped for parts, and her crew would scatter to new ships or new lives. The alarm started without warning, and Lieutenant Morrison jerked upright at her station as her displays lit up with readings that made no sense, and she checked them twice before she spoke, because what she was seeing could not be real. And when she finally trusted her instruments enough to report, she turned to Captain Shaw and said that they had a massive energy signature appearing 200,000 kilometers away, and it was bigger than anything in their database. And Shaw moved to stand behind her, looking at the tactical display where a shape was emerging from hyperspace, like a monster rising from deep water, and through the main view screen, they all saw it appear, and the bridge went silent as every person stopped breathing for just a moment, because what they were looking at should not exist in this sector of space and should not exist anywhere near human territory. And the ship that materialized before them was a Krethian Empire Dreadnought, and it was 5 times the size of the Liberty's Dawn, with a hull that bristled with weapons that could destroy planets and armor that could withstand anything the small human frigate could throw at it. The Krethians were a warrior species that viewed humans as primitive upstarts who had stumbled into space travel without earning the right to be there, and they had been testing human borders for months with small raids and probe attacks, but never anything like this, and intelligence reports had said the Krethians were years away from deploying their Dreadnought-class vessels into human space. And yet here, one was hanging in space like a dark moon, filled with death, and Captain Shaw felt his mouth go dry as he stared at the impossible sight. And he knew without being told that this was not a chance encounter, and this was not a patrol gone wrong, and this was an act of war, or the beginning of one. And he had to make decisions now that would affect not just his crew, but possibly the future of human space itself. Ensign Lee tried to send a distress signal to the nearest human fleet, but his board lit up with jamming indicators and nothing was getting through the interference, and the Krethian ship was creating a bubble of silence around them that stretched for millions of kilometers in every direction, and they could broadcast all they wanted, but no one would hear them and no help would come. And Shaw realized they were alone and cut off and facing an enemy that could destroy them with a single shot. And the Krethian ship opened a communication channel without being asked, and the main screen flickered and changed to show a Krethian commander sitting in what was clearly the bridge of the Dreadnought, and his name, according to the translator, was Vekthor, and his voice came through speaking the human language with contempt, dripping from every word. He told them that this space would soon belong to the Krethian Empire, and that the human ship should surrender now, and the crew would be allowed to live as slaves, which was more mercy than primitives deserved, and he gave them 5 minutes to decide their fate. And Shaw looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew, and he saw fear there, but also something else, and he saw people who had chosen to serve even knowing they would end up on forgotten ships, in forgotten corners of space. And he made a decision that broke every regulation in the book, and he called for a vote, asking his crew whether they should surrender or fight, knowing that fighting meant certain death. And the vote came back unanimous, and not a single person chose to surrender. And Chief Henderson said over the intercom that he had kept this old ship flying for 20 years, and he might as well see what she could really do when pushed to her limits. Shaw opened a channel back to the Krethian commander, and he straightened his worn uniform and he looked directly at the alien warrior on the screen, and he said that the Liberty's Dawn declined the generous offer, and if the Krethians wanted this sector of space, they would have to take it from human hands, and those hands would be cold and dead before they let go. And Vekthor seemed almost amused by the response, and he said that human defiance would be remembered for the brief moments they had left to live, and he cut the transmission, and the Dreadnought began to move forward like a predator that had finished playing with its food and was ready to strike, and Shaw ordered shields raised and weapons armed, and all hands to battle. Stations and the Liberty's Dawn prepared to fight a battle she could not win against an enemy she could not defeat. And in those final moments before the fighting began, every person on that old ship knew they were about to become either heroes or footnotes in history, and they chose to make it count. Shaw questioned Krethian honor directly and said Vekthor came to this system with a Dreadnought to destroy a single patrol frigate and brought support vessels to jam communications and set up an ambush against an enemy that could not possibly threaten him, and asked where the honor was in that, because from where Shaw sat, the Krethian commander was just a bully picking on someone weaker, and nothing more. And Vekthor rose from his command chair, with his voice shaking with rage, and he said the human knew nothing of honor, and that he was Vekthor, victor of the Andalas campaign, and destroyer of the rebel fleet and champion of the Empire, and Shaw said coldly that Vector should prove it by facing them in equal combat with no support vessels and no sensor advantages and no jamming, and just his Dreadnought against the human frigate in the radiation zone near the star, where neither had an advantage unless the Crethean was afraid that without all his technological superiority, a human crew might just be his equal. Vector said Shaw was insane because the human ship was crippled, and Shaw replied that they were still there and still fighting, and asked if the Crethean was warrior enough to finish this face-to-face, or if he needed to call for more backup. And Vector's fists clenched as the battle between rage and tactical sense played out on his face. And finally rage won, and he accepted the challenge, saying he would destroy the humans in honorable combat, and their corpses would serve as a warning to any who dared question Crethean might, but he would not offer mercy again, and they would die screaming, and Shaw said they would see who screamed and cut the transmission. Morrison immediately reported that Vector was recalling his support vessels and setting course for the star. And the Crethean commander had actually fallen for the challenge, and Shaw said it was pride, which was a human trait, but apparently they were not the only ones who suffered from it, and he ordered Helm to plot an intercept course and take them into the radiation zone, and all hands to battle stations, because this was it, and the Liberty's Dawn turned toward the dead star with her damaged engines straining, and behind her the Crethean Dreadnought followed like an ancient sea monster, pursuing its prey into treacherous waters. As they approached the star, the radiation levels began to climb with alarms sounding throughout the ship, and the temperature rising despite the struggling life support systems, and Morrison reported that radiation was at dangerous levels, and their sensors were starting to fuzz out, and she guessed the Crethean sensors were too, and Shaw said that was good because that was what they needed, and he asked Henderson how the reactors were doing, and Henderson said they were screaming but holding, for now. And the two ships entered the radiation zone, both partially blinded and both struggling against the stellar forces buffeting them. And on the view screen, the Dreadnought was visible through the distortion, still massive and still deadly, but now just as vulnerable as they were. Shaw opened a ship-wide channel one last time and told all hands it had been an honor serving with them, and when they told this story, they should remember that they were just a patrol frigate, with an outdated ship and a crew that refused to quit. And he closed the channel and looked at his bridge crew and ordered Morrison to target the Dreadnought's primary reactor and fire everything they had left. And Morrison said she was targeting with her voice steady, despite the chaos around them. And weapons were ready, and Shaw gave the order to fire. The Liberty's Dawn unleashed its final barrage with missiles and railgun rounds and laser fire, and everything that still functioned, streaking through the radiation-hazed space toward the Dreadnought, and the Crethean ship returned fire with plasma. Lances cutting through the interference, and both ships were taking damage now, with the Liberty's Dawn shuddering as hits tore through what was left of her armor. But their weapons were finding their mark too, and hammering at the same spot on the Dreadnought's hull and drilling deeper with each impact, and Morrison shouted that they had a hull breach on the Dreadnought, and they were penetrating the armor, and Shaw ordered them to keep firing as another impact rocked the bridge. The Liberty's Dawn groaned like a living thing in pain, with entire sections venting atmosphere, and lights flickering and dying, replaced by emergency lighting, and the temperature spiked as the radiation overwhelmed their shielding. But they were not done yet. And one final missile, their last one, streaked across the gap between the ships and penetrated the hole their weapons had carved in the Dreadnought's hull, and detonated inside directly against the reactor containment field. And for a moment nothing happened, and then the Crethean Dreadnought's reactor containment failed catastrophically, and a sun bloomed in space like a miniature star born from alien technology turned against its creators, and the blast wave expanded outward, consuming the Dreadnought and reaching toward the Liberty's Dawn. On the bridge, Captain Shaw watched the wall of destruction approach with his crew at their stations facing the end, with the same courage they had shown throughout this impossible fight, and he said quietly that it had been a privilege, and the blast wave hit, and everything went white. Space was silent after, with the dead star continuing its slow burn, indifferent to the human drama that had just played out in its shadow. And the Crethean Dreadnought was gone, reduced to expanding debris and fading energy signatures, and where the Liberty's Dawn once fought there was only wreckage. But in that wreckage something stirred, and deep in what remained of the engineering section, Chief Engineer Henderson opened his eyes, pinned under a collapsed support beam with pain shooting through his body, but he was alive, and emergency lights flickered in the smoke-filled compartment, and he croaked into his suit radio asking if anyone else was alive. Static answered him at first, and then weak and distant came Morrison's voice from the bridge saying the captain was still breathing but barely, and asking if anyone else had made it. And Henderson said engineering was checking in and how many survivors did they have, and Morrison counted 7 so far with the forward sections gone, an aft section sealed off, an environmental failing, and maybe an hour of air left. And Henderson started working to free himself, ignoring the pain, and he explained that the reactor pulse must have triggered the emergency bulkheads which sealed off sections of the ship and saved whoever was behind them. More voices started reporting in over the next few minutes, with Palmer alive but injured in what was left of the helm section, and Dr. Grant trapped in sickbay with 2 patients, and Ensign Lee in auxiliary communications, and a handful of others. Scattered throughout the dying ship, and 14 survivors out of 68 crew members and 14 people, in a ship that no longer deserved the name, drifting in space with failing life support and no power. And Henderson finally pulled himself free and began a painful journey through the wrecked corridors toward the bridge, seeing the price of their victory, with bodies of crew members who did not make it, and blast damage that turned metal into twisted sculptures. When Henderson reached the bridge, he found Shaw trapped in his command chair by fallen debris, and Morrison was using a damaged console as a makeshift pry bar, trying to free him, and Shaw asked for a report with his voice weak and blood-staining. His uniform, and Henderson said the ship was dead with reactors offline and power gone, except for emergency batteries and main hull integrity at maybe 20%, and they were venting atmosphere from multiple breaches, and most of the crew did not make it, and Shaw asked how many, and Henderson said 14 survivors, and Shaw was silent for a long moment before asking about the Dreadnought. Morrison said it was gone, and Shaw's plan had worked with the reactor blast, destroying it completely, and the jamming field had collapsed, and Lee reported from communications that he had auxiliary power to the array, and it was damaged, but functional, and they could send their message now, and Shaw told him to do it with a full burst transmission on all frequencies with everything they recorded, so the fleet would know what happened here and know about the Krethian advance. And Lee sent the message, saying that if anyone was listening within 5 light years they would hear it, and Shaw said that was good, because they did it, and they held the line, and Morrison checked the tactical display, reporting no contacts in the system, with the Krethian support vessels having fled when the Dreadnought exploded, and the nearest human outpost 3 days away, and they were alone. Shaw asked how long they had, and Henderson said life support was failing, with emergency bulkheads holding but losing air to micro breaches throughout the hull, and best case they had 6 hours, but more likely 4, and Shaw took a deep breath, then winced at the pain in his chest and said they would make these hours count.